Okay, welcome to VIB 657. This is so not the way I wanted to kick off our semester, and yet it seems so appropriate for 2020, doesn't it? That we should have technical difficulties on our first day that we couldn't really overcome. Yeah, there were some workarounds that technical support was suggesting, but I knew in the end, by the time we got all of that coordinated via email and got it up and working, we would all be frustrated and class would probably be over. And so I thought, better to cut our losses, regroup next week, and just do what I could to get you some of the major concepts that we were going to go over this week in class. So, very sorry not to be able to see you in person. I will apologize in advance that this video is going to be a bit clunky. I'm going from a script that was designed for face-to-face, well, via Zoom, to something that is recorded, and those aren't necessarily commensurate. So we'll just do the best we can. Here we are. VIB 67, I usually get to kick off the semester as the first group experience for students because most fall semesters begin on Mondays. Obviously, we started on Wednesday this week, so Dr. Gastel got to have that honor. So all of you had a chance to introduce yourselves, get to know each other a little bit, but I haven't heard your stories yet, and I was really looking forward to that in class this week. So my approach to that was going to be a little bit different. What I was going to have each of you do was not introduce yourselves, but introduce one of your classmates. I thought that would be fun. I thought that might be entertaining. And you can imagine how that would have gone. I may have assigned each of you to introduce a particular other classmate whom you may know well or not. You may remember all of the details that they shared with you on last Wednesday or not. I think that would have been fun to do, just to change things up a bit. You would have gotten some details wrong. You would have forgotten some details. And then the follow-up to that activity was then to go around the room and debrief each of you. How did the person who introduced you do? Did they get all of the details right? Were there mistakes that were made? Were there distortions? Were there things that you wish they had shared about you? And aside from being kind of a fun, ice-breaking activity, my goal was really also to kind of set the stage for today's lecture, which is also to set the stage for our class this semester. So some of the things I was hoping to bring out of the discussion that ensued was that communication is difficult. It's difficult to communicate your own story to people. It becomes even more difficult to communicate somebody else's story. And it doesn't really matter what medium you're using, whether we're talking about doing this in writing, whether we're talking about doing this in person, whether we're talking about recording a video like I'm doing right now. There are challenges at every step, and each medium brings its own challenges. But it doesn't really matter which medium you're using. There are going to be serious challenges to communication. And it's the challenges of communication that are the subject of this course. We're going to be focusing, of course, on the challenges of communicating scientific information, but these are true regardless of what it is that we're trying to communicate. That then was going to lead to a break. During that break, I was going to invite you to type out some questions in the chat bar, things that you'd like to know about me and my background and what this course is going to be about. So we're going to forego that, I think, for next week, kind of introduction. But go ahead and start thinking about it now, and feel free to email me ahead of time if there are some things that you'd like to know about me or about the course or about science and technology journalism that I might be able to share. And we can just kind of kick off our second week of class that way, assuming Zoom starts working again. I really like to start the semester by considering communication theory. And I know some of you are probably even more familiar with communication theory than I am, at least formally, especially if you have a communications background. But I think it's a really interesting way, an important way to start off the semester. So we really can't begin talking about communication unless we talk about information. And all of these are terms that we tend to throw around, right? We talk about communication, we talk about information, but we often don't take any time to reflect on what we actually mean by that, or even define what we mean by that. Most of the time, that isn't terribly important, but oftentimes it becomes critically important, and it's not uncommon to find that people are using these terms in slightly or even significantly different ways, and they don't even realize that they're using it in different ways. So I'd like us to start by considering what we mean by information. So if you're reading this in a Zoom class, I would ask you, what does information evoke for you? Take a moment, even though this is a video, to think about that. What do you think of when the word information is thrown around? One way I like to start thinking about information is to reflect on a sign that I would run into all of the time when I was in upstate New York. Anytime you left a town, you would see a sign like this, end 35 mile per hour limit. Sometimes the number might vary, but usually it was 35 miles per hour, and it would always just say we're ending that speed limit. I was there for 8 years. I was never able to figure out exactly what that meant. And to this day, I don't know what exactly that means. I know that I'm no longer required to cap my speed at 35 miles per hour, but it doesn't necessarily give me any idea of how fast I can go. Contrast that with this sign, speed limit 55. That's what I grew up with. That's what I'm familiar with. That lets me know that I can drive up to 55 miles per hour. And if I'm honest, that means I'm going to go at least 60, probably 65. But I know that I could get into trouble if I drive faster than 55. So I would argue that the sign on the left is more informative than the sign on the right. As a practical matter, they may both mean exactly the same thing. And I'm sure that if I were driving through a small town where I had been driving 55 miles an hour, speed limit was reduced while I was driving through the town to 35 miles per hour, and then it said I end 35 mile per hour speed limit, then I would probably assume that I could drive 55. But if I'm going through a fairly large town, that's not at all obvious. And in many cases, in many contexts, while I was driving through upstate New York, it was not at all clear what the speed limit might be on the road that I was approaching. And so I have no idea why people in New York use the end 35 mile per hour limit signs, because to me, they're not terribly informative. And this really gets us to the essence of what information is. And really, at its heart, information is a way of reducing uncertainty. The sign on the right, it does reduce uncertainty to some extent. It leaves a lot of room for interpretation, and there are a lot of speeds that I might think I can go. Whereas the sign on the left gives me a definitive answer about how fast I can drive. So one sign is more informative than the other. And this brings us to information theory. We can trace the origins of information theory back to the 1920s. A lot of the early work was done in Bell Labs, and they were really interested in this because they were trying to transmit information, and so they had to define what information was and figure out how much they could transfer and how much infrastructure they needed to transfer that information. Alan Turing used the principles of information theory to break the German Enigma codes during World War II. And probably the seminal work in many ways can be traced back to Claude Shannon in 1948 in his paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication. He was concerned primarily with determining limits for data storage and transmission. Again, this is kind of what started with the Bell Laboratories. But what made Shannon's work interesting and unique and new was that he adapted theories from statistical thermodynamics. And that's reflected in some of the language that surrounds information theory. So for instance, you may or may not have heard of Shannon's entropy, which is really what we just talked about, a measure of how much uncertainty is resolved with a bit of information. And so I'll be honest, a lot of information theory goes way over my head. You can get in really deep, and it's really, it's fascinating stuff, but it's also really heady stuff that requires a lot of technical jargon to understand. And abstract theories that I have a hard time wrapping my mind around. But this is how it began, and it was very much about this idea of reducing uncertainty and how much information could be transferred from one place to another using existing infrastructure. And closely related to information theory is communication theory. And really, which one is a subset of the other depends on your perspective. Some information theorists will say communication theory is the subset, and people who are communication theorists will say information theory is a subset. They're so overlapping that it's really hard to distinguish between the two. But as a start, and this is a huge simplification of communication theory, but at the most basic level, communication theory starts with this idea that you have an encoder, an individual who has something within their field of experience that they want to transmit to somebody else. That might be something really abstract like communication theory, what I'm trying to communicate to you right now via this medium. Or it might be something far more visceral, such as, watch out, there's a venomous snake at your feet. Whatever that is, the person sending that message has to first encode that in some way. And most of the time when we're thinking about communication, we're thinking about that in terms of encoding it as language, but there can be other kinds of encodings as well. Whatever seems appropriate for that medium, the sender then broadcasts that, and that could be through sound. Most often probably that's how we think of it, or it could be through recorded video or recorded word or interpretive dance. Whatever it is, the encoder sends that to somebody else, and that person becomes the receiver of that information. Now, that person is going to decode that message within their field of experience. If there's a lot of overlap between the encoder and decoder, between the sender and the receiver, then there's a good chance the message will get through, and that what started out as an idea in the encoder's mind will become a similar idea in the decoder's mind. If there's not much overlap between that, then the information becomes much more difficult to transmit and much less reliable. And so a lot of information theory depends on this feedback between sender and receiver to know whether or not there's been success. Probably the easiest example to think of, or the most extreme example that you can think of, is if the encoder and decoder don't speak the same language, then there's very little overlap in their field of experience and very low chance that the message is going to get across. So that overlap becomes really important. And at the same time, there is a lot of noise in this process that can distort this message. So for instance, I'm broadcasting this now via video, and some of you are watching with rapt attention, no doubt, but others of you are probably checking social media while this is going on in the background, or maybe responding to a text, or reading your emails or social media. Whatever it is, those are things that are making it less likely that my message will get through. And so again, at the heart, that's what communication theory is all about. On the surface then, this becomes a really simple idea. But as you start to unpack it, it becomes a lot more complicated. Just to give you an idea, there is sort of a standard textbook, a first look at communication theory, that's used in many communication theory courses. If we just looked at the 9th edition of that and some of the chapter titles, we'd see things like agenda setting theory and cultural studies and communication privacy management theory, coordinated management, cultural approach to organizations, cultivation theory, and actually expectancy, dramatism, elaboration, likelihood models, and much, much more, semiotics, genderlect styles, you name it. This gets really complicated really fast. So simple on the surface, but there's a lot there to unpack. And when you start looking at each component of communication theory, each part of that chain from sender to receiver, it can get pretty hairy and deep. So theories, that's another word we kind of throw around a lot and don't really reflect on. Theories are simply explanations of how or why things happen the way they do. This is a really handy definition from Stone, Singletary, and Richmond, clarifying communication theories, a hands-on approach. Another handy definition comes from Communication Theories in Action by Wood, who says a theory offers an account of what something is, how it works, what it produces or causes to happen, and what can change how it operates. Theories pursue one or more of four basic goals: description, explanation, prediction or understanding, and reform. So why are we interested in theories in science and technology journalism? Why are we beginning our semester with this? Well, theories provide important frameworks. They help generate research questions, which is going to be something really important for those of you who are thinking about doing a thesis option for your master's. Theories also help us focus attention on particular aspects of questions, problems, or phenomena. Now, even if you're not going into the thesis track, you're going to be reporting on science, and science is often very theoretically driven. So understanding what theories are will help you understand what the scientists are engaged with, what they're focusing their attention on. Theories also make falsifiable predictions, and they become refined through research that they generate. Importantly, different theories aren't necessarily in opposition to one another. So sometimes you may have theories that on the surface would seem to be in opposition to one another, but when you really dig deeply, you find out that they're actually complementing one another. So let's transition now into sort of abstract ideas of communication theory, information theory, and theory in general, and see how that might apply to the issues in science and technology journalism. Here we go back to that model we were looking at, that very simplified model of communication theory where we have a sender and a receiver, an encoder, a decoder, each within their own fields of experience that may or may not overlap, and this noise that's in the process. So that's a pretty generic model that can fit into lots of different scenarios. For instance, what if the sender is a scientist and a receiver is a member of the public? So if we were in class, I would have us unpacking this for a little bit of time and ask you, perhaps in pairs or just as a collective whole, to say, what are some of the issues that arise when you think of the sender as the scientist and the receiver as the public? And we may have time for that conversation in future classes. In fact, I hope that we do, because it becomes really important. For instance, what is the overlap in the field of experience between a scientist and a member of the lay public? Probably not a lot. There are a lot of misconceptions by the lay public about who scientists are and what they do and how science comes about, just as there are huge distortions in scientists' minds about who the public is and what they need to know and how they can be influenced. So just positioning the scientist and the public in this model, we can start to unpack some of the issues that are going to face you as a member of the journalistic society covering science and technology. Given that there is very little overlap between the world of the scientist and the world of the lay public, we can then expand on this model and complicate it a little bit. One of the things that's going to ensure that you have a job in science and technology journalism is because the role of a journalist really becomes a dual one within the communication chain from the scientist to the public. In this model, this slightly more complicated model, we have two chains. We have from scientist to journalist, and then from journalist to the public. Now, it is vastly oversimplified to think of this as a linear chain all of the time. Information does not always flow from scientist to journalist, from journalist to the public. There are lots of other stakeholders in this and a lot of other players in this. Furthermore, there's information that goes the other way as well, from the public to the scientist, and scientists don't always get their information from other scientists. They very often get information from journalists as well. So journalists are very often the senders to the scientists. But this will help us kind of unpack how this course is going to unfold and some of the issues that we're going to be addressing in VIBS 657. So again, if we were in class, I would then say, okay, let's just look at this piece of the puzzle. What are some of the issues when we place the scientist as the sender and the journalist as the receiver? I will post on eCampus the readings for next week. One will be a reading called Scientists' Intuitive Failures. I'll post that to eCampus. Another reading is Science in Public, the second chapter of that. That's one of your required texts, so hopefully you've had a chance to acquire that. And then there's a short book / pamphlet called On Being a Scientist, and I'll provide a link to that as well. You can get a physical copy of it, but it's freely available on the web, so I don't see any reason to spend money out of pocket for that. In addition to the readings, though, I do have an assignment that I would like you to do. So the assignment for next week is I would like you to find a scientific poster on some subject that interests you. Now, in previous semesters, I've required that be an actual physical poster posted somewhere on campus. And my reasoning for that, my goal in that, was to have you kind of get a feel for the space that scientists occupy. In addition to finding the poster, I wanted you to take notes on, where were these posters located, who would be likely to come across these posters. And, by peeking through the windows or, maybe even walking into the labs or talking to people in the halls, I wanted you to get a sense of who scientists were and what their world is like. What is their workspace like? With COVID-19, that seems like a decidedly bad idea, and especially with us all spread out as we are. So I'm going to, this semester, change that to where you can download a scientific poster. There are lots of them available. That part won't be difficult at all. And what I want you to do next week is to create a presentation about that poster. What did you find? But I don't want just a dry recitation of what the poster is about. I'm really more interested in who the people producing the poster are. This is going to be an imaginative exercise, especially since you can't actually get in and see where these people are working. I want to know what the poster is about, but I also want to know what are your impressions of the people that created the poster. Who are they? What do you imagine them and their professional world to be like? What motivates them? How do you think they measure success? Who are they imagining their audience to be with these posters? Now, I'm not asking you to write a feature article about this research group, but you should be thinking of the kinds of details that you might find in a feature article. And oftentimes what makes feature articles so much fun to read is that they include personal details about the scientists themselves. What do they look like? How do they talk? What is their office like? What is their lab like? I want you to be thinking about those kinds of details. Now, feel free to do as much research as you want online and find out as much about these people as you can that way, in that sort of impersonal way. But this is not an exercise in factual accuracy. This is really an exercise in imagination. And so I really want to get a sense of how you think these people operate in the world and what their artifacts that they leave behind, in this case through a written form of discourse that's very peculiar to the scientific community. What does that reveal about them and their preoccupations in the world that they occupy? These presentations, I'm only expecting to be about 10 minutes or so, maybe 15 minutes. Since there's so few of us, that would be fine, but not looking for an hour-long presentation by any stretch. And that's where we're going to begin our explorations of the issues in science and technology journalism, because regardless of whether or not information flows linearly from scientists to the public through journalists, the scientific enterprise is centered around scientists and their world. And so we need to get an understanding of that world in order to better understand the roles of journalists and this flow of information from the scientific community to the public. So, again, this is not how I imagined the semester to begin, but it is so 2020 that it began that way. So I will put as much information as I can on eCampus. Feel free to email me about any questions you might have or set up a Zoom meeting with me, and hopefully next week will go a lot smoother. So take care. We'll see you then.